Thanks very much. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank both Senators Monning and his co-author Jackson for Senate Bill 657, which became AB 361, and thank Assemblyman Ajadian for AB 361, which, though not specifically seismic, would be relevant if this county ever had to deal with the after effects of a seismic disaster, supporting our Office of Emergency Services as an important part of our county's defense, and we now know its budget is stable and ongoing. Likewise, thanks to Senator Monning for realizing the importance of the state's independent peer review panel and its work, which will now become another feature for as long as the Diablo license is in effect. Today I speak as a ratepayer advocate. The Alliance is filed in all current Diablo CPUC proceedings. As the power generated at Diablo is nuclear, its safety, that is the potential to harm the environment or people through discharge or radiation, is regulated by the federal NRC. But safety comes at a price. And as the NRC itself has declared in its recent rejection of the petition by the St. Louis Mothers for Peace at their intervention of the Diablo relicensing proceeding, those costs and economic concerns rightfully belong to our state. In fact, it's their own language that determination of the economic viability of continuing the operation of nuclear power plants is an issue that should be left to the appropriate state regulatory and utility officials. The NRC has no role in deciding whether a nuclear power plant should continue to operate based on economic considerations. Which brings us to policy regulation as it relates to seismic safety at Diablo Canyon. But first, some history. When the state had abrogated or abdicated its responsibility to ratepayers, the results were costly. During the original licensing of Diablo Canyon, the NRC did not require, nor did PG&E seek, an analysis of offshore potential faults. Construction of the then approximately $350 million plant began in 1969. By 1969, when the aforementioned Hosgri fault was discovered, not by NRC or by PG&E, but by oil geologists for the Shell Petroleum Company, and it was found to be 3.5 miles away and capable of much greater force than the plant's design. It resulted with a retrofitting, and this lack of oversight by the utility and its federal regulator ended up costing ratepayers, not shareholders, but ratepayers, $4.4 billion over what was the original $350 million price tag. Now, one might think that such errors are a thing of the past, but fast forward 40 years to 2011, and the NRC, responding to the discovery of the much closer shoreline fault in 2008, declared that that fault was not segmented, not linked to the Hosgri fault in a joint rupture scenario, and did not extend beneath the land once it left the seafloor. And as we've heard earlier today, the 2014 research and conclusions by PG&E contradict these earlier but extremely adamant findings by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Thus, the public's ongoing mistrust of the credibility of that regulatory agency. Now, concerned with this pattern of lax regulatory oversight by the federal government, Senator Monning's predecessor, Dr. Blakesley, introduced AB 1632, which required the California Energy Commission to undertake a compilation of scientific studies to determine the potential vulnerability to a major disruption due to aging or a major seismic event of a large baseload generation facility. Dr. Blakesley's concerns were informed by the concurrent earthquake-induced shutdown of the Kashiwazaki nuclear plant in Japan in 2007. Although those reactors shut down without disastrous effects or major radioactive release, it was the secondary damage throughout the facility that managed to bring down the world's largest nuclear facility at 7,000 megawatts, kept it offline for years, requiring billions of dollars in repairs, only to have it idled again in the post-Fukushima Japanese environment before it could even be brought back online again. Thus, this recommendation from the California Energy Commission's AB 1632 report: the non-safety related systems, structures, and components of the plant are most vulnerable to damage from earthquakes. Damage to the non-safety related structure, systems, and components is the greatest source of seismic related plant reliability risk. They're then told, evaluate the seismic vulnerability and reliability implications for the nuclear plant's non-safety related components from changes to seismic design standards that have occurred since the plants were designed and built. You'll notice here the emphasis is on the non-safety. We've heard that the NRC regulates and has said the safety components can withstand the maximum earthquake. Fine. What we asked, and the state asked, and our legislature asked in AB 1632 was everything else surrounding the plant, because a reactor that remains whole while everything from the parking lots to the administration buildings crumble is not a facility that's going to do what our Public Utility Commission expects it to do, prudently and reliably generate cost-efficient electricity. And that is what the Kashiwazaka example proved in Japan before the Fukushima event. Has PG&E complied or not with this recommendation initiated by our legislature to examine this non-safety systems, which are nonetheless vital to reliable and affordable electricity generation? Well, in 2010, PG&E did submit a report by their consultant Enercon addressing these issues, but the report fails in two key ways. The work was performed many years before the newly discovered and reinterpreted seismic hazards were identified in 2014, and the 2010 analysis uses an earlier Electric Power Research Institute database with ground accelerations lower than PG&E's 2014 maximum accelerations from faults and rock areas of lower velocity where these important non-safety structure components are located. When PG&E was questioned in the current Public Utilities Commission proceeding as to this inadequacy, their response was that such a non-structure and safety component analysis was not a part of the funded $64 million seismic studies. Indeed, that may be so, but that doesn't mean that this hanging question has been answered to the satisfaction of the state oversight and regulatory agencies that asked it. How will increased shaking, now predicted, affect the low-velocity areas built on fill, such as the switch yards and other vital subsidiary electric generation areas and components? If these updated calculations are not performed, the state's confidence regarding the reliability of the plant will rest solely on outdated analysis of data that failed to include seismic threats newly identified through the AB 1632 research. The legislature should continue to require a current and up-to-date response to these questions hanging from AB 1632, and the independent peer review panel should be empowered to administer and critique and analyze any seismic component therein. So, while the NRC may have a role in proclaiming that Diablo Canyon will be able to safely shut down in the event of an earthquake without discharging radiation into the environment, and let us assume that it does, and we've dodged that bullet, the state, our state, has concerns regarding the damage and recovery left in the wake of such a scenario that goes beyond safe shutdown. For example, the following issues would be of great concern to those who regulate and concern their need for power and economy. For example, can the facility be restored to working order? We saw that in Japan with Kashiwazaka. It was years and billions of dollars of work, only to then have that later upset by the Fukushima event. How long will it take to restore the facility? If we're told it's a vital component of our electric grid and an important asset, well, then how long would that take to bring back to life? What is the cost of restoring that facility? We have only the Japanese examples to go by, but that quake, a 6.5, which again did not cause core or internal nuclear meltdown, was billions of dollars in repair. What will be the impacts of an outage during this time to grid reliability? And if it's determined the plant can come back online, what would be the cost of the associated seismic retrofit requirements? These are the questions that AB 1632, again, in the wake of the Kashiwazaka nuclear incident, we're looking to find answers to, but they remain largely unanswered. Much focus is placed on, you heard, the NRC-centered safe shutdown. Granted, we hope they can do that. That's our expectation. It's continuing to get reliable and affordable electricity that concerns us as ratepayers. Reliance solely on NRC oversight has indeed been costly to our state's ratepayers. In addition to the historical Diablo cost overruns that I mentioned earlier, We have, for example, the more recent example of the San Onofre situation, where in a report issued a year ago, the NRC's own Inspector General found the NRC staff at fault for their lax oversight in administering the steam generator replacement program. Those approved by the NRC parts for replacement at a cost of some $700 million soon failed, leading to the permanent shutdown of San Onofre, and that has brought upon it a $3.5 billion controversial settlement that will be foisted upon ratepayers to pay off that failed facility. Thus, when considering our state's interest, there is great value in having state oversight, and that is where this independent peer review panel certainly comes into play. We've heard from Mr. Wills, and for example, I'll pull up one more. Here's an example of some analysis by the independent peer review panel. I don't have a pointer, but you're the pointer. Never, you know, PowerPoints, pointers, and fancy stuff. Okay, push the little button that's marked there. There we go. There. Oh, you got to hold it. There it is. One example is when the PG&E, as you saw from their charts earlier, here's the ground motions that they came up with. However, the independent peer review panel in the upper chart took a look. And what happened was they find that using an ergodic method, an older method for computing ground motions, as opposed to PG&E's methods, which, as Mr. Wills mentioned, there remains question at the conclusion of his speech about the particular formulas on which they're arriving. But when using the accepted ones, the IPRP's chart shows all exceedances using the standard methods that are now in effect. And this is a huge difference that, of course, may not have come to light without the IPRP's presence on this issue. You saw those tornado charts earlier. And again, the broader the top, the greater the uncertainty. Well, the last chart that Mr. Wills had, which didn't get much thing, shows that at the top of the chart, and this was only introduced at the 9th meeting of the independent peer review panel by PG&E, the greatest uncertainty on top of the Haas-Green and slip rate now became the actual method of calculation and computation that they plan to use, by which these numbers, through calculational mathematics, get reduced. And it is encouraging to hear that the IPRP, again, is taking utmost seriousness, investigating, and evaluating where these models fall and what their value will be. So that is some of the value that this committee brings to guarding our investment and our future ongoing costs. And again, we thank the senator for his portion of that legislation, which keeps that panel empowered and funded. In fact, among the unresolved issues before the IPRP, in addition to the aforementioned one, or including that, is exactly that, discrepancies between the empirical borehole measurements. These were measurements done over 30 years ago, which somehow show in actual rock samples different velocities, as we heard mentioned, traveling wave velocities than the computer modeling and the color charts that we saw today. PG&E's lack of data for their near-field earthquakes and ground motion calculations. Again, it was explained in the very end of Mr. Will's thing about the speed at which and the terrain through which these waves propagate and travel. PG&E has two measurements, a Parkfield and a San Simeon, by which to populate an entire model. Well, that's sort of like flipping a coin, saying one is heads and one is tails. When building an average, you'd want a lot more data to fill that set. Also included would be PG&E's assumption, and this was a new discovery in the most recent IPRP meeting, that ground motion saturation, in other words, the closer the quake gets to its center, within those last few 1,000 feet, 1,000 yards, whether it's 6 or 7 or 8, doesn't matter, because the ground has become so jumbled, in a sense, it doesn't matter what the magnitude is you put in. 6.5 is pretty much the most that you're going to get. Well, that's a concern now before the IPRP. And as well as we raised at the last meeting, PG&E's misrepresentation that all three models for the Irish Hills, and again, we had seen the Irish Hills on an earlier map, would get an equal weighting in the center, body, and range, as you heard, the way that these things are being placed together. But in fact, it gets the short straw in the model, and that was the one that their own emails indicate had the greatest hazard. And so to all of these, I conclude where this was heading, which is AB 1632 was created before Fukushima. Now, since Fukushima, we've heard PG&E, and as Dr. Hill has explained, has a series of SHAC studies that'll be here submitted in 2015 and in continuing evaluation through 2017. But here's the catch on that. As you heard, probabilistic. It's now moving for, well, just how bad can it be to, well, but is it likely to happen? Now, this is where statistics move into public policy. What one person feels might be adequate, you know, when you're flying on a plane, you may choose to take that chance or not. And you may base it on evidence that 99.99% of the planes get where they're going comfortably. Well, I shouldn't use that word. These days, no air travel's comfortable. Let's just say you arrive in one piece, bent and cramped, though you might be. But this is the interesting thing. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, again, is accepting the how likely it is over the how bad can it be. But as we've seen, the NRC has led in many instances to million-dollar burdens for California ratepayers because of flaws in their regulation. And so what we are seeing is that what AB 1632 originally asked for were deterministic, worst-case scenarios. The California Coastal Commission agrees with this. In fact, for them to issue the needed federal equivalency permit under the Coastal Zone Management Act, they have said they will require deterministic hazard evaluations. And as I say, we've seen from the previous graphs, through calculational sleight of hand, while PG&E may minimize those risks, the deterministic risks do exceed what the plant was designed for. And so we might ask, is that a strategy or a gamble that California's ratepayers, who will be paying for all of this ultimately, can take to the bank? Is it a strategy our state's leaders can count on when planning to oversee reliable and affordable power for the world's 7th largest economy? The state's interests go beyond the concerns that the plant shut down.
Mr. Weisman, I'm asking you to wrap up your overtime at this point. Thank you.
Last sentence. The state has further-reaching concerns beyond the NRC regarding cost and reliability of electric power, and our agencies and legislatures can and must ask if the potential seismic risk from that point of view merits further imprudent or reasonable investment of ratepayer dollars for this source of generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.